Hello, budding biologists, and welcome back to your Unit 1 Notes on Ecology. Today, we are going to cover symbiosis and relationships among organisms. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to analyze scenarios of each type of relationship and identify the role each organism plays. Our relationships are going to include predation, parasitism, commensalism, mutualism, and competition. Additionally, you'll be responsible for analyzing graphs for all types of relationships. Let's make it make sense, shall we? As we venture forward, please remember to document examples of each relationship in your notes. All right, looking at our organism interactions, also called relationships, we're going to start over here with number 1, mutualism. Mutualism is a type of ecological relationship in which both organisms involved are going to benefit from the interaction. This interaction enhances fitness, survival, or reproductive success of both organisms. So essentially, it's going to be a win-win situation. My favorite example of this is a bee and a flower. As you get to know me, you'll learn that I'm very fond of bees. And we all know that bees gather nectar for themselves from flowers, but what you may not think about is that during this process, they also transfer pollen from one flower to another. So the pollination process is going to be essential for flower reproduction, allowing it to produce seeds and fruit, and in return, the bee obtains nectar as nourishment. So with both the bee and flower benefiting, this is a mutual relationship or an example of mutualism. Coming on over here to number 2, commensalism. Commensalism is a type of ecological relationship where one organism benefits and the other remains largely unaffected. It's simply not bothered. The example we have here is with sharks and smaller fish. Believe it or not, sharks often interact with other fish without preying upon them. For instance, certain types of smaller fish might accompany larger sharks during hunting expeditions, and the smaller species will feed on the leftovers or scraps from the shark's prey. So this is an example of commensalism because the smaller fish benefit by obtaining food, but the shark is generally unaffected. It's just not bothered. Coming over here, we have number 3, parasitism. And parasitism is an ecological relationship where one organism, known as the parasite, benefits at the expense of the other organism, which we're going to call the host. The parasite derives nutrients, energy, or other resources from the host, which often causes harm or negatively impacts the host's health. For the example here, we're also looking at fish, and certain types of parasites will attach themselves to the bodies of fish. The parasites will feed off the fish's blood or nutrients, potentially weakening the host fish and causing harm. So parasitism, one is benefiting, the other is harmed. Coming down here, we have number 4, predation. Predation is an ecological relationship in which one organism, known as the predator, will hunt, kill, and consume another organism known as the prey. This relationship plays an important role in regulating populations and maintaining balance in ecosystems. And our example is going to be the grizzly bear and salmon. So grizzly bears will display predation by hunting and consuming salmon. Over here we have number 5, our last interaction, which is competition. Competition is an ecological relationship where 2 or more organisms compete for the same limited resource. That could include food, water, shelter, or as the example here, a mate. So for competition, we have an example of 2 bucks or male deer. Bucks often compete for access to mates during the breeding season. So they might engage in physical contests such as antler clashes, as we see in the photo, in order to establish dominance and secure the right to mate with females. This competition among bucks highlights the struggle for limited reproductive opportunities within their population. All right, and just to recap, I briefly want to define each of our ecological relationships. Mutualism is when both organisms benefit. Commensalism involves one benefiting while the other remains unaffected or not bothered. And parasitism occurs when one organism benefits and the other organism is harmed. I also have other examples here. If you need me to elaborate, please ask me in class. For these top three relationships, it's important that you can also represent or identify them in a graph. So let's talk about what that would look like. Please take a moment to pause the video and ensure all three of these graphs are in your notes. All right, starting with the first graph up here, you can see that we have the number of organisms over time. And as we look at the graph, organism 1 is going to be red, organism 2 is going to be blue, and the solid line is displaying what the relationship looks like when they're living separately. The dotted line, what happens when they're interacting with each other and living together in the same environment. So looking at this graph here, we can see that when the two organisms are living separately, they are both seeing an increase in the number of organisms. We do see a positive correlation. However, when they're living together, both number of organisms increases greatly. So this, as you probably have guessed, is going to be mutualism. We're seeing an increase in both our blue line and our red line. So both organism 1 and organism 2 are being benefited. So looking at our graph here, we can analyze that the red is essentially unaffected. We see a very small change from here to here, but all in all, it really doesn't change much. So red is not bothered. It is unaffected by the relationship, whether it's living separately or living together. Blue, on the other hand, organism 2, when it's living separately, does see a slight change from here to here. But when they're living together, that is a drastic increase in the number of organisms. So organism 2 is benefiting from this relationship. It benefits from living together, while the red organism, organism 1, is essentially unaffected, making that commensalism. So again, let's start. What does it look like when they're living separately? So our solid lines essentially are the same. When these two organisms are living separately, we see a slight increase in both populations. However, looking at organism 1 first, we see a very obvious increase when these two organisms are living together. So organism 1 is obviously benefiting from this relationship, while organism 2, we're seeing a decline in the population. The number of organisms does go down over time. So organism 2 is harmed by the relationship. Organism 1 is benefiting, making this relationship parasitism. All right. Let's take a moment to distinguish our other two relationships. We have predation and competition. So remember, predation involves one organism consuming another, whereas competition arises when organisms vie for shared resources. All right, for predation, it is important that you can analyze the relationship graphically. So please take a moment, ensure this graph is also in your notes. And for predation, we're going to look at the relationship between rabbits and coyotes. So you might see this called the predator-prey population trend, or a predation graph. Predator-prey and predation can be used interchangeably. Right. As we look at this graph, I want you to notice this is similar to our previous graphs. We're looking at number of individuals over time. Purple is going to represent the rabbit, and then red is representing our coyotes. And as you look at the graph, you can see that the population trend is oscillating. It is going up and down. It is circulating over and over again. And the reason for that is that as our rabbit population increases, there's now more resources in the form of food available for our coyote. So our coyote is also going to increase. Over time, our coyote will overhunt our rabbit, though, causing its number of individuals, its population to decline. But if our rabbit declines, our coyote now has less resources in the form of food. It has less prey. So now our coyote will also decline. And we're going to see that happen over and over. So as our coyote declines, our rabbit increases. As our rabbit increases, our coyote increases. But then it starts preying upon our rabbit. So the rabbit decreases. Our coyote then has less food, so our coyote will decrease, and we'll see that happening over and over again. All right, hopefully you guys are feeling better about the graphs. We will practice these more in class. I do want to transition to one of our vocab words, and that's symbiosis. So symbiosis, also called symbiotic relationship, is going to refer to a close and long-term interaction between two different species in a biologic community. All right, out of the relationships we've explored, can you pinpoint which are examples of symbiotic relationships? So which ones involve close long-term interactions? And I'm hoping you said mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. All right. So you might be asking, why are competition and predation not symbiotic? I do want you to think about it for just a moment. The reason we're going to say that predation and competition are not symbiotic is because, remember, our definition for symbiosis is a close long-term relationship between two organisms. Predation does not occur over a long period of time. It's a very instant predator-prey relationship where one organism hunts and kills the other for food. Competition, while it could be a close interaction, does not have to be. So if you think about different organisms drinking from the same watering hole, they are using the same resource, but this could be a very short and indirect relationship. So we are going to consider predation and competition ecological relationships, but our symbiotic relationships are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. All right, briefly, I want to discuss how organisms adapt to their environments. You do not need to write this down for Unit 1, as we will circle back to discuss adaptations when we cover evolution at the end of the year. However, I want to point out that the environment challenges organisms in diverse ways, and I want to briefly cover how that can affect them over time. So observe the polar bear. Take just a minute to look at him and how perfect he seems to be for the environment. So that's actually due to him adapting to the available resources in that environment. So in each of these examples, the organism's adaptations are finely tuned to the specific challenges and opportunities presented by the environment. So again, we will elaborate on this in the spring, but it's important to know that the environment plays a crucial role in the survival of different species. All right, that brings us to the last thing I want to discuss, and that's going to be the impact of invasive species. If you aren't familiar with the term, an invasive species refers to a non-native organism, often a plant, animal, might be a fungus, or a microorganism such as bacteria, that is introduced to a new environment outside of its natural range As a result, it causes significant ecological harm. So invasive species often thrive and spread rapidly due to the absence of natural predators or controls in the new habitat. A prime example that is local to us is going to be the introduction of zebra mussels into Lake Lavon. So, zebra mussels are small, invasive freshwater mollusks. They're actually native to the Caspian and Black Sea regions in Eurasia, and they were accidentally introduced to North America through the ballast water from ships. So, once introduced, they began to establish themselves and reproduce very rapidly. And unfortunately, they can outcompete native species for resources like food and habitat, which leads to a decline in the native biodiversity, a decline in the native species, which in turn affects the ecosystem dynamics as a whole. But for now, please understand what an invasive species is and the effect it can have on an ecosystem. All right, this concludes our journey for today. Remember, if you have any questions, please jot them down so we can discuss them in class. Here's a meme that will hopefully make you smile. All right, see you guys in class.